This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
This week we're digging into gravestones. Hello family historians, and welcome along to episode 72 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. You are with the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
The Talk Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians, or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Tonight's discussion is the latest in a series of weekly supplements that we are posting leading up to the publication of my new book, The Practical Introduction to Medieval Genealogy, which comes out in February 2026. That launch date is getting closer all the time, and when we get there, the podcast will revert to its normal format of monthly episodes. Now, these weekly episodes are meant to be short, about 10 or 15 minutes, certainly no longer than 20, and I'm using them to highlight some of the details from my own research, discoveries that have more than rewarded the curiosity of this genealogist with too much time on their hands. Now, the roots of tonight's talk really go back to a comment which the Trouble and Strife made when she heard me recording the previous episode. She wanted me to explain the strapline, the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Was it entirely complimentary? Well, it certainly was, but I didn't really want to explain it because that takes away the mystery, doesn't it? But I promised that I would do a couple of episodes which would demonstrate the advantages of being a genealogist with too much time on their hands, and this is one of those episodes. I want to remind you that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you who has spent far too many years digging up his family tree, so often in the wrong place. And these episodes are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. And please do remember that I am talking about ancestor hunting in England.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Now, on the surface, the details of my great times 7 grandfather's life seemed rather ordinary. He married 3 times. But it is the grave of his daughter-in-law, the grave of my great times 6 grandma, that really sparked my interest. She died in 1765, and the stone is still visible. It is still visitable now and then, still standing. It's made of Switzerland slates, which is a story in itself, but it has a very nice inscription on it. And that inscription reads, I, Phoenix-like, have made my end to leave 2 children and my friend. So to prevent ensuing crimes, nature laid me to bed betimes. Now, I read that and I thought, what a fascinating verse. All right, we even have the Mason's initials, J.S. I like this reference to a friend. I thought, I wonder if that friend actually wrote the verse. And I decided that I would spend some time digging into it. We did identify who the 2 children were, but I wondered if it would be possible for me to uncover the poet. I began by examining the phrases used to try and determine whether it's written by a man or a woman. Clearly it was written in the voice of the woman, the mother, but who actually wrote it? Perhaps this friend. Well, I have to say, on one level, my research was quite disappointing, but on the other, it was quite informative.
Did you catch some of our recent episodes? Episode 49 featured 3 Australian brothers, while episode 48 discussed Admiral Sir John Hawkins. Take Peeps, for example, was episode 30, while number 35 looked at marriage registers and 31 discussed church wardens. TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and now and then, a bit of a blog. And now, on with the episode.
It seems that the verse was adapted from a collection of epitaphs which was freely available and widely used. Now, there were many of these, but one in particular was written by John Bowden. It was called The Epitaph Writer and published in 1791. It described itself as a handbook for stone cutters and ministers containing over 600 epitaphs. It was designed to provide ready-made verses for tombstone, and the Phoenix type verse that I have found belongs to that repertoire. Now, interesting to me is that it does say it was a handbook for stone cutters as well as ministers, and we do have the mason's initials. I do wonder if he had more than a hand in selecting the verse. There are other examples. In the late 19th century, William Andrews produced a collection of epitaphs copied from graveyards, and again it shows that this type of verse, using many of the same terminologies, was quite widespread. So unfortunately, no, it wasn't written by a local friend. But because the terminology is quite common, it means that we can go some way to interpreting what's been spoken about.
Malcolm Noble has written a practical introduction to medieval genealogy, over 400 pages, covering the sources, their history, and important chapters on evaluation and analysis of evidence, scaling research pathways, and much, much more. Order your pre-publication copy now from Malcolm Noble at rocketmail.com.
The speaker identifies themselves as leaving behind 2 children. And in the 18th century and in memorial verses, often women were memorialized in terms of maternity. Leaving children and a friend really means leaving children and the husband. Very often, the word friend is a euphemism for husband, especially in dissenting circles. Now, the phrase "nature laid me to bed betimes," now the metaphor being laid to bed is strongly associated with childbirth and maternal mortality. Many 18th century epitaphs for women who died young use this phrase of being laid to bed to suggest literal lying down in death and the bed of childbirth. Male epitaphs rarely use bed imagery, unless of course it's a military bed of honour. The concern about preventing ensuing crimes could mean preventing illegitimacy or scandal, again a moral anxiety often projected onto women's death in childbirth. And in 18th century England, epitaphs for women frequently emphasised early death in childbirth or betimes mortality. Okay, let's just summarise what we found. Genealogical and antiquarian collections of 18th century epitaphs note that women's memorials often emphasise maternal roles, and early death, betimes, especially denotes death in childbirth. Now, scholars of epitaphs categorise verses like this one under recurring but unattributed epitaphs, formulaic lines that circulated widely in parish registers and graveyards without a clear authorship. In our case, the persona of the verse is feminine, a mother speaking of leaving children, and a friend, which generally means the husband. But epitaphs were usually written by men, clergy, family, or local poets, versifiers as they would say. So the pen was likely masculine, even if the voice was feminine. The prominent points from this verse were the phrase, 2 children and my friend. Epitaphs for women often list surviving children and the husband. Nature laid me to bed betimes, a phrase strongly associated with maternal mortality and the bed of childbirth. The concern about preventing ensuing crimes could mean preventing illegitimacy or scandal, again, a moral anxiety often projected onto women's death in childbirth. And then the phoenix imagery suggests renewal through offspring, reinforcing the maternal theme. So there we are. It just shows that if you have time on your hands and you can dig into the background to inscriptions on gravestones, it can sometimes be quite illuminating. My name is Malcolm Noble, and if you've enjoyed tonight's podcast, then you are the genealogist with too much time on your hands. The next in this series of short supplements will be posted at 5 minutes to midnight next Sunday night, and then in February we will return to our regular monthly format.
Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode. I wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night, Chip, and thanks for listening.
This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.